Welcome to Victor English Story. In the year when the sea forgot its own tides, the city of Halcyon still pretended that everything was ordinary, and every morning the bells rang above the harbor. Merchants opened their painted shutters, bakers scattered flour over wooden counters, fishermen untangled their silver nets, and children raced through the narrow streets with pockets full of glass marbles and fig seeds. But beneath that polished rhythm, there lived a fear so ancient and so carefully hidden that no one spoke of it. Above a whisper, because beyond the black cliffs west of the harbor there stood a lighthouse that had not shone for 19 years. And everyone knew that when the lighthouse was dark, the sea kept count. Elias Marr, who repaired clocks for a living and preferred broken things to perfect ones, first noticed the change on a rainless afternoon in late autumn when a woman in a green veil entered his shop carrying a brass pocket watch that had stopped at exactly 4:13 and would not move no matter how carefully he cleaned its gears. He opened the case, held the delicate machine to the window, and saw that the tiny hands trembled as if resisting some pull from far beyond the room. And before he could ask where she had found it, the woman said, in a voice too calm for the strangeness of her request, that the watch had belonged to the last lighthouse keeper, and that if Elias could make it tick again, she would pay him in something more valuable than gold. Elias should have sent her away, because Halcyon had rules older than the stones of its foundations, and one of those rules was simple. Nothing from the lighthouse was to be brought into the city, touched, repaired, carried, named, or remembered. But Elias had spent his life among the stubborn hearts of mechanical things, and curiosity had always entered him by the same door caution used when it left. So he accepted the watch, promised to examine it, and only when the woman was gone did he realize she had not left a single wet footprint on the shop floor despite the storm gathering outside. He worked until midnight by the light of 2 oil lamps, laying out the watch's pieces on a felt cloth, studying a movement far more intricate than any he had seen. For between the familiar brass wheels and coiled spring there lay a second arrangement hidden beneath the first, a secret geometry of silver teeth and hair-thin chains that could not possibly fit within the case, and yet did, as if the watch were larger inside than outside. At the center of that impossible mechanism sat a tiny disk of dark glass, and when he tilted it toward the lamplight, he saw not his reflection, but a tower rising above waves, under a moon too large to belong to any sky he knew. At 4:13, the watch began to beat in his palm, not with the orderly pulse of a timepiece, but with a warm, unsettling throb of a sleeping bird, and every clock in his shop answered at once, all of them striking a single note, though none of them marked the hour. And from somewhere beyond the shuttered window came the long, hollow sound of a horn blown out at sea. Elias did not sleep. Before dawn, he wrapped the watch in cloth, locked his shop, and climbed the hill to the house of Mara Vale, who had once mapped the coast for the Navy before a shattered knee and a worse argument had convinced the admirals she was too inconvenient to keep. Mara lived in a square stone house crowded with charts, sextants, old rifles, and books salted at the edges by years of sea air, and she listened without interrupting as Elias described the woman in the green veil, the impossible mechanism, and the horn that had sounded from a sea where no ship had been due. When he finished, Mara poured black coffee into 2 chipped cups and told him the story people only told children when they wanted them indoors before dark. That long before Halcyon became a city of traders and chandlers and polite civic lies, it had been a place chosen for one purpose only, to watch the western horizon for the return of the drowned fleet, a procession of ships lost in a war no chronicle fully recorded. Carrying a king who had promised not to die until he reclaimed the shore from which he had been betrayed. The lighthouse had been built not to guide sailors home, but to keep something else away, and every keeper had been taught the same duty, which was not to tend the flame alone, but to wind the heart lantern beneath the tower each night before moonrise, because if the lantern slowed, the sea began to remember the dead. Elias asked why no one had spoken of this as fact if it mattered so much, and Mara gave him the bitter smile of someone who had lived long enough to see terror become custom, and custom become superstition, and superstition become entertainment. Because, she said, taking the wrapped watch from his hand and not unwrapping it, the last time people treated it as fact, the keeper died, the light went out, and the council discovered that fear is easier to govern when it sounds ridiculous. By noon, they were joined by a third companion, not by plan, but by inevitability. Lynn, the apothecary's daughter, who had followed Mara's messenger boy, forced the truth from him with a coin and a threat, and arrived at the house with hair full of wind and anger in equal measure. Lynn was younger than both of them, and carried the quick confidence of someone who had spent her life being underestimated into competence. And when Mara told her to leave, she folded her arms and said that the western wells had turned brackish overnight. The harbor gulls had vanished, and 3 patients had come to her mother complaining of dreams in which wet men stood at the foot of their beds, asking what year it was. So if the old lie was about to become real, she intended to see it with her own eyes. Mara swore, Elias hesitated, and the sea, as if choosing for them, sent a wave so hard against the harbor wall that bells rang all across the lower city. By evening, the 3 of them had gathered supplies and slipped through the old customs gate before the storm broke. Rope, lantern oil, dried figs, a crowbar, a compass, Mara's pistol, Lynn's satchel of tinctures and bandages, and the wrapped watch, which Elias carried inside his coat, where he could feel its strange pulse steadying as they approached the cliffs. The path west wound through abandoned vineyards and low pines twisted by salt wind, and all along the road they found signs of quiet disorder that made the air feel crowded even when the landscape stood empty. Sheep penned but untended, doors left unlatched, a cart overturned without damage, as if ordinary routines had been interrupted in the middle by a thought too frightening to finish. Near dusk, they reached the village of Cinder's Hook, the last settlement before the cliffs, and found it almost deserted except for a few old people sitting outside the chapel with bundles at their feet, as though prepared to flee but too tired to begin. One of them, a blind net maker with white scars where his eyebrows should have been, asked whether the watch had started again, and when Elias stared in surprise, the old man tapped his own chest and said the sea told its news to anyone whose body had once nearly belonged to it. He warned them not to follow the cliff path after sunset, because the drowned would walk it before the moon reached its height. But Mara merely thanked him and asked whether the chapel still had the tunnel under the apse. It did, and by full dark they were descending stone steps beneath the altar into a passage built by hands that had not cared if future generations understood the labor. The tunnel smelled of wet limestone, lamp smoke, and something sweetly rotten that Lynn could not identify. Old iron rings had been fixed into the walls at intervals, and on several of them hung lengths of chain, snapped through by force rather than rust. For nearly an hour they walked in silence, except for the drip of unseen water and the low hum Elias felt before he heard, a vibration like a distant choir sustaining a single note. At last the tunnel rose, narrowed, and ended behind a panel of warped cedar that opened into the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Dust lay thick on the floor, but not evenly. There were tracks. Some were clearly recent and human, boot prints wet with salt, but crossing and recrossing them were other marks that looked like bare feet dragged rather than lifted, as if their owners had forgotten how walking worked and were imitating it from memory. The cottage itself had been left in a panic 2 decades earlier, and then somehow continued to decay in a deliberate way, as if every object had chosen a position that told part of a warning. Cups smashed beside a cold hearth, one chair turned to face the sea, ledgers stacked neatly except for a single volume left open beneath the window where the pages had fused with damp. Lynn found a child's drawing tucked behind a shelf, a crayon lighthouse under a black sun, and on the back a line written in a careful hand: "If father fails, close your ears before the horn." Mara found a trapdoor to the undercroft barred from above with chain and a harpoon shaft. Elias found the bedroom, where the wallpaper had peeled into shapes like kelp and the mirror above the washstand had been covered with sailcloth stitched shut, not nailed, not tied, but sewn as if what it concealed should never be accidentally uncovered. When he cut a single thread, the watch in his coat grew hot enough to burn, and from beneath the cloth came a voice too faint to be sure of itself, saying his name in the tone of someone remembering rather than calling. He stepped back, heart hammering, and Lynn told him not to touch the mirror again unless he planned to explain why every glass bottle in her satchel had just cracked at once. They gathered in the kitchen, and Mara used the crowbar to force the trapdoor. The chain came free with the sound of old metal surrendering, and a draft climbed out from below carrying the scent of stormwater, machine oil, and long-closed tombs. A spiral stair descended beneath the cottage into the body of the cliff, and at its base they found the chamber no councilman would ever mention by accident: the Heart Lantern Room. It was circular, larger than the cottage above, and walled with black stone veined in copper that caught their lamplight in dim red threads. In the center rose a mechanism half furnace and half orrery, a vertical assembly of rings, weights, pistons, and crystal chambers surrounding a reservoir of pale fire that floated in water without mixing with it. Thick cables vanished upward toward the lighthouse tower, and around the room's edge stood 24 niches, each containing a keeper's journal sealed behind clouded glass. The machine was not dead, but dying. Its motion had slowed to an irregular laboring crawl, and each time the central piston failed to complete its stroke, the flame dimmed and the room shuddered, as if some pressure outside answered the weakness from afar. Elias approached with the instinctive reverence of a clockmaker entering a cathedral of his own religion. He saw immediately that several gears had jammed, not from ordinary wear, but because something fibrous and black had been wound through their teeth, something like hair soaked in tar. He reached with pliers to pull it free, and the entire machine gave a groan so human that Lynn turned away. Mara, meanwhile, pried open one of the journal niches and found the last keeper's final entries. They read by lantern light while Elias worked. The keeper had written of hearing footsteps on the lantern stair when no one else was present, of gulls flying west at midnight and returning at dawn featherless, of a woman in a green veil who came each week to ask whether he was lonely and whether he understood that the light did not imprison the dead, but imprisoned memory itself, which was crueler. In the final pages, his handwriting became jagged. He wrote that the Heart Lantern no longer responded only to winding and calibration. It required witness, a living mind willing to remember the names of those it kept away. Each night, he had stood before the flame and recited the known dead of Halcyon's betrayals, and as long as he remembered them, the sea forgot the path home. But now his wife had died, his daughter was sick, and he feared his mind slipping. If he failed, he wrote, whoever came after must not repair the lantern by mechanism alone. It would need a name willingly given to the dark. Lynn read that last line twice. Mara read it once and closed the journal. Elias said nothing, because in that moment the watch clicked open inside his coat without his touching it. The dark glass disc had become clear. Inside it lay a miniature harbor under moonlight, and on the tiny western breakwater stood the woman in the green veil, waiting. The chamber trembled. Somewhere high above, in the sealed lantern room, a chain began to hammer against metal in the rhythm of a ship's bell. Mara swore with the concentration of a prayer and ordered Elias to keep the lantern moving while she and Lynn checked the tower. They climbed the inner stair through stone damp with old storms, passing walls carved with names and dates and little else, until the stair opened into the lantern chamber where the great lens sat cracked like a frozen eye. There, standing among salt-blown shards, was the woman in the green veil, dry despite the rain needling through the broken glass. She looked no older than when Elias had seen her in his shop, yet her face held that unsettling stillness some portraits acquire after too many generations have stared at them hoping for recognition. "You came sooner than I expected," she said, not turning. Mara drew her pistol. Lynn asked who she was. The woman touched the iron railing around the lantern's core and said she had once been called Isoldmar, which made Elias feel the floor shift under him, because Mar had been his mother's name and his grandfather had always refused to speak of the branch of the family lost on the Western Road. Isolde told them that she had been the lighthouse keeper's daughter, the child who drew the black sun, the girl whose father had sewn the mirror shut when he realized the sea had already begun to teach her its reflections. She had not died when the light went out. She had crossed. There was, she explained, no clean boundary between living and dead, only direction, and the drowned fleet sailed not through water alone, but through remembered grief, searching always for shores where the old wound had not been named honestly enough to heal. Halcyon had been built by traders who invited a king to anchor in its bay under truce and then burned his ships for profit before the treaty was signed. The dead of that night had not risen because they were evil, but because they had been denied the one thing death requires to become bearable, witness without convenience. The lighthouse, Isolde said, was not a prison but an eraser. It kept the city safe by feeding its memory to fire. Every generation forgot more than the last. Elias asked what that had to do with him. Isolde finally faced him, and her eyes held the color of surf under moonless cloud. "Because your mother left before the forgetting was complete," she said. "Because your blood remembers the names even when your mind does not. Because the watch chose you." Mara replied by cocking the pistol and saying that ghosts and ancestral guilt could wait until after the city survived the night. Isolde almost smiled. "There is no after unless you choose what survives," she said. Then the horn sounded again, this time so near that the lantern glass quivered. All three turned west. Beyond the cliffs, where darkness and storm should have met in formless black, there now moved a line of lights low on the sea, dozens of them, swaying in impossible formation. Masts emerged, then sails, then the black hulls of ships gliding over water too calm for the gale roaring over land. No wave struck them, no rain touched them. The drowned fleet had come. What followed happened fast enough to feel dreamlike and slow enough that every detail left a mark. Bells began ringing in Halcyon below, though no living hand had reached them. The sea around the cliffs rose in smooth walls. Figures appeared on the deck of the leading ship, motionless men in scorched uniforms and barnacled armor, their faces pale as wax, their eyes reflecting the lantern chamber like mirrors. In the harbor far behind, dogs howled all at once. Isolde told Elias there were only two ways to stop the fleet: restore the Heart Lantern fully and let the city forget again for another generation, or extinguish it forever, open the shore to the dead, and force Halcyon to remember what it had bought with silence. Mara demanded a third option. Isolde's gaze softened with a sorrow almost kind. "There was," she said, "but it was 19 years ago, and your council buried it." Lynn stepped to the shattered window and watched the leading ship angle toward the harbor mouth with no regard for reef or rock. "If the city remembers," she asked quietly, "do they all die?" Isolde answered with the honesty of something long finished pretending. Some, maybe many, but not because memory kills. Because truth breaks structures built to avoid it. Mara lowered the pistol a fraction. Elias thought of his shop, of the market streets, of the blind net maker, of children with fig seeds in their pockets, of all the ordinary lives balanced unknowingly on a machine that burned history into safety. He thought, too, of every clock he had repaired, each one made to count forward honestly whether the hour pleased its owner or not. He asked what the keeper had meant by a name willingly given to the dark. Isolde said the lantern needed a living memory bound into its fire, someone to stand and witness and be changed by it, someone who would carry the dead without letting the city surrender them again. Not a sacrifice of life, she said, but of ease. Whoever gave their name would no longer be able to live inside forgetting. The dead would remain near. The sea would always speak. The city might survive, but would do so under an unblinking conscience. Before Mara could object, Elias knew. He went down the stair alone, while above him the horn sounded a third time, and the whole tower shook with the arrival of the first wave against the cliff. In the heart lantern chamber, the central flame had thinned to a frail, twisting column. He stripped the mechanism to its failing core with the swift precision of a craftsman who finally sees why every previous repair failed. Not because the machine was too complex, but because it had been built to require a human truth no tool could counterfeit. He cleared the tar hair from the gears, reset the counterweights, opened the silver valves, and placed the impossible watch inside the cavity where a regulator should have been. It fit as though made there. Above, footsteps pounded, stone cracked, wind screamed through the shaft. Elias stood before the flame while it reflected all the versions of his face he might have had in gentler stories. "My name is Elias Marr," he said, and the room listened. He spoke the names he knew from family graves and harbor plaques and old ledgers, then names he did not know how he knew, names pouring into him with the brine-cold certainty of inheritance. Sailors burned under truce, cabin boys trapped below deck, cooks, navigators, debtors, deserters, wives waiting on the shore, the king who never reached the banquet prepared for his murder, the child who drew the black sun, the keeper who failed because grief and duty had demanded the same voice at once. As he spoke, the flame rose. The mechanism caught, stuttered, then drove forward with a force that lifted him to his toes. Water and fire spun together inside the lantern without destroying each other. The black stone walls glowed red. Through the two,